Good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. My name is Gustav Venter. I head up the Center for Sport Leadership at Marty Sport, and I'll be moderating this afternoon's session. Please note that both your microphone and camera feeds are automatically muted during this live event, and that you will only be able to interact with us through the Q&A functionality available on your screens. So please use this option to type any questions that you might have during the session, and then I will feed these to our presenters at the appropriate times. Also, just note that the session is being recorded and we will be distributing this on Marty Sport social media afterwards. So if you also have colleagues that maybe miss out on the live portion, you're welcome to make them aware of those links. This is the third webinar in a series currently being hosted by Marty Sport, and today's topic deals with the use of technology in university sport, both from a practical and research perspective. The current COVID-19 crisis has forced most of us to become quite tech savvy in a very short space of time. So we felt that it was appropriate to reflect a little bit on some of the technological applications within university sport more broadly. And that's what we're going to be doing this afternoon. The session will last for about 75 minutes maximum, probably an hour. And we'll give you an opportunity to interact with our two presenters, who are firstly Mr. Grant van Velden, Manager of Sport Technology and Training Innovations here at Marty Sport, and then also Dr. James Brown, a postdoctoral fellow in the Institute for Sport and Exercise Medicine, otherwise known as ISIM. So Grant will begin by talking about some of the high performance applications of technology within the Marty Sport environment, after which James will present on some of the research applications. Both presentations will last for approximately 15 minutes, and we will also field some questions during and after these talks. So with that, we're ready to get started. I'm now going to hand over to Grant for the first portion of our session. So Grant, you can now share your screen, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much, Gustav, for inviting me onto the webinar today. I'm excited to be presenting and sharing a bit of knowledge with all of the attendees. I've entitled my presentation "A Day in the Life of." So this is going to give you an overview of all of the technology that is available to our student athletes at Marty Sport, how we use it, in the different capacities to improve sports performance. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so generally a student athlete's day at Stellenbosch University starts very, very early in the morning, around about 5 o'clock, where they will wake up, and one of the first things that they need to do is fill in their daily wellness, and that is done using an app through an athlete monitoring system called SmarterBase. You'll see the video on the right hand side, some of the questions that we would ask the athletes. They would then rate how they are feeling to some of those responses, such as number of hours of sleep, upper body muscle soreness, lower body muscle soreness. You can see that they can indicate on the diagram of the body here which areas of their body they may be experiencing pain. They also have the option of filling in some comments and letting the coaching staff know any additional bits of information that weren't necessarily covered by answering the questions on the sliding scale. So this information gets fed through automatically into the SmarterBase network, and our strength and conditioning coaches and performance scientists get access to this information on a daily basis, and they can feed any information to coaches that they deem necessary, or make changes to their training sessions accordingly, based on the feedback that they get on the athlete's daily wellness. After that, some of our teams will make their way off to the rugby fields adjacent to the Stellenbosch University Gymnasium, where they may have access, or they may be running a recovery test known as a HIMSS test. And a piece of technology that we use is the Polar Team 2 live heart rate monitoring system. So the players will arrive at the field, They will wear a heart rate belt around their chest, which will obviously pick up their heart rate response during the HIMSS test. The HIMSS test, for those of you who are not sure or haven't heard of it before, it is a submaximal test. It is very similar to a bleep test, and the athletes will run this test and will be able to collect their heart rate data and how their heart rate responds to the test. That information is then analyzed, and we are able to see whether an athlete has recovered enough from their previous training session or match, or if they potentially need a little bit of additional rest or recovery in order to be training at their maximum capabilities. After that, 6 o'clock, our high performance gym gets extremely busy with our athletes all coming in to train before class. Classes potentially start for some of our student athletes at 8 in the morning. So we need to get them in the gym as early as possible to put in a good hour training, to be able to head back to res or their apartment, have a shower and have some breakfast before getting ready to go to class. One of the pieces of equipment that we use to maximize our training sessions in the gym is a velocity-based training device called the GymAware. GymAware is a transducer that attaches to the bar and can basically measure how quickly an athlete is moving a specific weight. You might come into the gym and your 1 repetition max on the bench press is 100 kilograms on day 1. But if you come in for a training session the next day, you might not be able to lift 100 kilograms. And we would then need to adjust the load accordingly so that you are still working in specific velocity zones that target specific physical responses. So you get zones where you'll be working on maximal strength. You'll get zones where you'll be working on speed strength. You'll get zones where you're working on strength speed, for example. So the videos on the right, on the top right, is some of our Marty Sevens rugby players using the GymAware device. You can see on the right hand side of the bar there's a little Velcro strap, and it's attached to a string, and the actual GymAware unit is on the floor. The nice thing with the GymAware unit is it works via Bluetooth, and information is streamed directly to a dashboard which is displayed on an iPad. So our athletes can get information rep by rep what they are doing in the gym, whether they are reaching certain targets or not reaching certain targets, and things can be adjusted accordingly. On the bottom right is one of our track athletes also using the GymAware units in more of a speed movement. Good stuff. I'm not sure I was kicked out of the meeting there. I don't know if you can still see my screen or not.
I can see you, Grant. James, can you maybe confirm whether you can see it? Because I can still hear you and see the screen.
Yeah, I can still hear and see Grant.
Okay, I'm going to move. I'm back in. I can move on to the next one.
Okay.
Apologies. I'm not sure what's going on here. I keep getting kicked out of the meeting. Sorry, good stuff. I keep getting kicked out of the meeting here. Hopefully it's back now.
I can see the lecture slide off the lectures, yes.
Technology that we'll use is... Okay. Just go back here. Okay, let me go back. Sorry, apologies, everyone. I seem to be kicked off there for a minute. After that, our student athletes will go off to class, and that's sometimes the toughest training session of the day, but obviously they're student athletes and we value them getting degrees, so this is an extremely important part of the program. Over the university lunch break is an opportunity for our athletes to perhaps squeeze in an additional training session. Over here we have some of our track athletes making use of the FAST system. FAST stands for Force, Acceleration, Speed and Time. It is a laser system. You will see that the start blocks that are circled in green there, those actually have force plates inside them, and they can give us fantastic information on the forces that an athlete is applying with their left foot as well as their right foot as they come out of the blocks, and that information is displayed in and it looks similar to the graph on the laser follows the athlete as they run to the track. That will give us step-by-step information, almost centimeter down the track, what their acceleration is, what their speed is, and the time that it's taken them to get to certain distances. And that is representative in a speed graph or velocity curve, and that is the second graph displayed on the slide over there. Another option for our non-track athletes is to do an on-field speed and agility training session using the Smart Speed cells, which is made by Fusion Sport, or to perhaps get in a perceptual cognitive training session in our visual skills lab, where we work on reaction time, eye-hand coordination, peripheral awareness, dynamic visual acuity, a whole bunch of different skills that are important for mainly team sport athletes. So we have some of our sevens rugby players that are working on some various pieces of technology that we have in the innovation center. And on the left-hand side, we have a video of one of our rugby guys running through a speed test using the timing gates on the rugby field. Our athletes generally will return to class after their lunch break. And at the end of the academic day, which is generally at about 5 o'clock, they'll then return to the fields where they will have their afternoon training session. Over here, we can see one of our strength and conditioning coaches, Andre Smith, placing a GPS unit into one of our rugby players. We make use of a GPS athlete tracking system, which gives us a whole bunch of information and data on different variables, such as distance covered, number of accelerations and decelerations, the intensity that somebody is training at, and their high speed running distance, as well as time in certain speed zones. These GPS units are generally around the size of a matchbox or slightly bigger than a matchbox. They are worn in a performance vest in between the shoulder blades on an athlete's back, and they are extremely light and give our performance science staff some very good information on athletes' training sessions or their matches. Ideally, we would like to prepare our athletes as best as possible to deal with the load of a match, so we need to make sure that they are training at that kind of intensity, and that's where the GPS units come hugely in handy, is to make sure that we are getting the same kind of information and variables in our training sessions as we get in our matches. Another interesting way that we have used the GPS units in the past is with some of our track athletes. This is a video of one of our Paralympic stars, Charles du Toit, in an event overseas, and Charles would wear the GPS unit in training when he was trying to, when him and his head coach, Suzanne Ferreira, were trying to figure out different strategy for races, when to increase their pace in a race, or when to kind of hold back a little bit to save a little bit of energy in the tank for a final kick on the 100 meters. And this was a different use for GPS. It wasn't necessarily designed for track athletes. It was primarily designed for team sport athletes, but this is an innovative way that we've tried to use some of the technology that we have at Stellenbosch University and apply it in a different context. And we got some very interesting data, and we got some very good results from using the GPS system within track athletes. At the end of a training session, our athletes will then head back to residence or head home, and they will have to log their training load for the day. They will do this on the SmarterBase app that I spoke about at the start of the presentation. It will just be a different form that they'll need to fill in, and you can see on the video on the right the kind of options that an athlete will have to select based on the training that they did for the day, whether it was a coaching session or a conditioning session, how long that session was. They then give it a rating on an RPE scale, which is a rate of perceived exertion. So how tough was that training session for them on that day? And that information is used to calculate an athlete's training. It's important to monitor an athlete's training load so that we make sure that we are training safely as well as training effectively. If we train too little, we put our athletes at an increased risk of potentially getting injured, but in the same breath, if we train too much, we also put them into a danger zone where they could potentially get injured. So we want to try and manage our athletes' training load and get them in a sweet spot where their injury risk is reduced. After that, there's potential for athletes to potentially do some post-training or post-match analysis of either their team's performance or their individual performance. And this is an area within sports science and performance analysis that has changed drastically over the years. Gone are the days of teams necessarily needing to lug around these big cameras as displayed on the top left. There's a lot of stuff and a lot of information that can now be captured on cell phones and apps on cell phones. The cameras are becoming increasingly better and can take high definition footage using a phone. And then there's also the recent inclusion of drone technology, and there are a lot of teams internationally that are making use of drones to capture footage of training sessions and matches from a very unique perspective that might not necessarily have been able to be captured before. That footage is then generally fed into a video analysis software. We make use of Sport at Stellenbosch University, but there are a number of different platforms out there. There's GameBreaker, there's Huddle, just as some other examples. And those pieces of video analysis technology can then be used to specifically code certain events. If we take rugby, for example, there could be a button within the technology for all of the lineouts or all of the scrums or all of the penalties. And every time one of those events take place on the video feed, that button can be captured and a very, very small clip is created. That just makes reviewing of training sessions a lot simpler and a lot more effective and efficient. Before the days and the advent of this technology, video sessions used to be with a coach using an old VCR, and you would have to fast forward and rewind and fast forward and rewind in order to get to specific instances, and it could be very time consuming and very tedious. This new technology helps video sessions to be effective and efficient, and for coaches to pick out only specific information and have access to that information almost instantaneously. And hopefully all of that technology helps us as at Varsity Sport to see more images like this. Our student athletes representing us on the international stage or the domestic stage, and for South Africa, or to win Varsity Cup or Varsity Sports titles for Stellenbosch University. And that is me.
Thank you very much, Grant. I've got a couple of questions actually that have come through in the sidebar, and I'd like to continue to encourage our participants to use that Q&A functionality. I'm also a little bit nervous about the stability of your connection, so let's try and get a couple of questions in while you're still online. The first one was around the issue of consent. So how do you deal with the process of consent in terms of getting the athletes to submit their training data as part of these processes?
Sorry, Gustav, you just broke up there. I only heard you said something about consent. What was the actual question?
The question was, how do you obtain consent from the athletes to get their training data as part of the process?
Sure. You're breaking up a bit. I can't quite hear you, but I'm assuming it's about consent. The question is about consent to collect data. So there's obviously some very strict rules that the university applies with regards to collecting data, and that is something that we follow very strictly. We have had advice from the university on the procedures and the documentation that we need to have signed by our student athletes, and that is something that is signed specifically when athletes come into our program. So it is something that we are aware of, and it is something that we obviously want to follow the rules and correctly, yeah, so that information is collected, and athletes do agree. We've yet to have an athlete say that we can't collect their data, because ultimately we're using the data to enhance their performance and make them better athletes. So everybody wants to be the best potential athlete that they can be, and in order for us to do our jobs the best that we can as performance scientists, that data has a huge role to play and a huge impact. So yeah, as I said, we've yet to have an athlete say that we are not allowed to use their information.
Okay, thank you very much for that. There was also a question sort of similar to that regarding potential protocols around the use of drones at matches. Is there something like that? Can you comment on that?
Sure, Gustav. To be honest, I'm not sure what the rules are regarding drones at matches. I know that we don't make use of drones at Stellenbosch University. We're lucky that, for example, at rugby we have a nice bergpad that we can climb up the mountain and get a very unique perspective from very high up on the mountain and film our players. So we don't necessarily have a use for drones. I've yet to see the use of a drone at a rugby match. I don't know what the rules are with regards to that. I'm sure that there are some rules, and I'm sure that there are some rules that World Rugby would have had to have come up with as this technology has become available over the years. But yeah, I've seen our rugby teams. I saw the Springboks a few years ago when they were training. They were making use of a drone. I know England rugby make use of drones. I was lucky enough to visit Saracens a few years ago, and they make use of drones at their training sessions. I'm not sure about matches. Those professional teams that are generally making use of drones play in stadiums with very high seats and stands, so they can have the potential to put cameras on the roof of these stadiums and would probably get a perspective that is very similar to what a drone would provide.
Sure. I'm going to ask you one more question, and that's regarding the general response of student athletes with regards to the use of technology. So sometimes one finds in the professional ranks some coach saying things like, you don't want to overcomplicate the process, you don't want to expose the athletes to too much data. Is that something you believe in? How do you encounter any of these aspects?
So what we found is obviously in our environment is very unique. So we're dealing with student athletes that are arriving at Stellenbosch at potentially at the age of 17 or 18, depending on how old they are when they're matriculated. And these student athletes crave that they're a generation that craves information and data. So we found that there's been a shift over the last couple of years to where our athletes, let's say 5-6 years ago, we're not necessarily that interested in the data, whereas the new guys that are coming through, they crave this information. They want this, their data. They want it as soon as possible. I was lucky enough to be a part of our Varsity Cup rugby side, last year and the year before, and we had one particular player that if we played at 7 o'clock in the evening, the match ended at 9 o'clock. There was a post-match function, and then the guys would head home. And at 10 o'clock, he was messaging me saying, how much did I run, or how much kilometers did I run? So they're craving the information, and I think it's very important that as performance scientists working with this generation, that we need to give our athletes as much information as we see is feasible. We don't want to do analysis paralysis where we're bombarding them with information and there's an information overload. So we need to be smart, but we do need to give them the feedback on their performances. It helps to create buy-in. They don't feel, why do I have to run through these speed gates? I never get the information, or why do I need to wear a GPS on my back? I never know how far I've run in a training session or a match. So we found that if you can provide that information to the athletes, they are far more willing to put a GPS unit on their back, or to come into the vision lab and work on their visual skills, because they're getting that instantaneous feedback on, and they can see the improvement on certain piece of technology from week to week or training session to training session.
Sure, I think it's actually also quite appropriate after all, since we are situated in a knowledge-driven environment, being at the university level. So, you know, that actually makes sense that the athletes are so hungry for that. Thank you also to Mohammed for your comment around that sort of tension of obtaining, you know, useful data through something like the use of drones, but also the practicalities that are maybe challenging to implement that. Grant, I'm going to involve you in the conversation again a little bit later, but for now,
Sure.
I'm going to move over to the next presentation. So
Sure.
I'd now like to ask James to share his screen, yeah, it's over to you, James. We look forward to your insights into some of the sport-related research applications of technology, having just looked at some of the practical applications. So take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Gustav. I hope my presentation is now sharing. It should be.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Cool. So, yeah, I'm just going to talk about the research side of technology. Yeah, and thanks very much to Gustav for the invitation to be here. Also gave me an excuse to get out of a tracksuit for the first time since lockdown. So, just going to try and move to the next slide. Alrighty. So just an upfront disclaimer, which is standard in academic talks now. The research that I'm going to present here is partially funded by World Rugby and the Medical Research Council. Just to give you an overview, I'm first going to talk about the background of Marty Sport and ISIM, the Institute of Sport and Exercise Medicine, and then give you 3 kind of case studies of outputs from that relationship. So first, I just want to paint the picture that research and practice relationships, as we have here with ISIM being the research arm and Marty Sport being practice, are difficult. And that was summarized in this article by Martin Buchheit. The main difficulty comes down to difference in timelines of those 2 bodies. So if you look at clubs, and that's Marty Sport in this context, they have a requirement for a fast turnover of data. From the collection of data in days, do they want the meaning and interpretation of those data within weeks, so that they can affect changes to optimize their athletes' performance, so that they can obviously win the Varsity Cup or get the medal that they're going for. The issue with academic and research timelines is that they happen in far slower periods. So from my experience, and this talks to a question that was asked earlier, just to get ethical approval, which is required if you are doing research on any human subjects, including athletes, takes about 3 months at Stellenbosch University. And these are obviously very good processes and checks and balances that have to be in place, but that's the reality of it. That alone takes 3 months. To turn that data that you start collecting into a research paper can take 2 years from start to finish, by which time it's too late to have a real effect on the athletes within a competition. So the suggestion from this Buchheit paper is to kind of shortcut this by aiming for bite-sized research outputs, which can take the form of conference outputs, because there you still get a level of peer review and on some preliminary data, and at the same time you can implement these data and implement the meaningful changes into a team while it's still useful. And I also want to highlight that this relationship between ISIM and Marty Sport is mutually beneficial, and it needs to be. So the HP unit, what they get is a single repository for synchronizing all the data that they are already collecting on an athlete. And in this way, they're able to make evidence-informed decisions. On ISIM's side, there's a research repository for multiple research questions in a niche cohort. And also, what's important from our perspective is that there's incredible institutional knowledge. So between Grant, Sean Sermon, and Andre Smith, if you look at the sport of rugby, there's 35 years of experience they have at Marty Sport, which is critical for reassurance that the data that we're collecting is accurate and is meaningful. And so when I first got to Stellenbosch in 2017, one of the first things my boss, Professor Wayne Durham, tasked me with doing is to implement a system for athlete monitoring. And so we went away and had to get grant funding and relevant personnel to do this. So we were lucky enough to pick up Lindsay Starling, who just finished her master's at UCT in athlete monitoring. And through a grant we got, we were able to purchase SmarterBase, which really is one of the Rolls Royce of athlete monitoring tools. It's used by the Australian Institute of Sport and Liverpool Football Club, just to name a couple. And so at Stellenbosch, what we use SmarterBase for is a variety of things. The personal data on the athletes, so demographics, all of their injury and illness information. So anytime they report to a campus health service, whether it's a physio or a doctor, that information is logged in SmarterBase. Their training load data and wellness data, as Grant illustrated. And from these, you get the outputs of, hopefully, optimized athlete performance, welfare, which translates into performance ultimately, and on the research side, research outputs. So next, I just thought I'd talk through 3 case studies of where we have done this in the short time we've been involved with Varsity Sport since 2017. And the first is from the Varsity Cup season in 2019. And just in case any of the attendees aren't aware, Varsity Cup teams have a fairly set schedule, and this includes Varsity Sport. So it's all building up to a match on Monday afternoon or evening. And to get there, they have, on the week starts on a Tuesday, the training week, with a recovery day after the match. Then Wednesday is 1 training session, Thursday, Friday you have 2, Saturday you have 1 training session, and on Sunday it's used as a travel day if you have to get to your venue, and either rest or a light captain's run. And in terms of the year schedule, the first matches are about the 4th of February, and if you're lucky enough to be collecting data on a team that gets to and wins the final, like Marty's did in 2019, the final is on the 15th of April. So I just want to show you the data of 2 of these wellness measures that we capture. I'll start with muscle soreness on the top of the screen at the moment, and you can see at the bottom of the screen I've got the days in the week aligned as I explained to you, a Varsity Cup week, going from Tuesday, which is a rest day, all the way through to Monday, which is match day. Now bear in mind these data are reported in the morning, so on Monday those data are being reported in the morning before the match takes place. So what you want as a trainer or strength and conditioning coach is to have your players at their best as close to 5, or the top of each scale, on Monday morning. And you can see Andre, if you look at muscle soreness, has done an absolutely perfect job here. His players have the least or the best muscle soreness the day before the match, and that's exactly what you need to achieve as a strength and conditioning coach. So he's done it perfectly there. But what we found interesting when we looked at stress levels, there was no weekly pattern. We expected to see a peak on Monday morning. They were stressed before the match. And because we didn't see anything here, we decided to look at stress with the help of a statistician over the season. So I'm just going to superimpose the Varsity Cup season here so these dates mean something to you. So you can see that obviously there was a dip. So the players were most stressed on the 15th of April, which you can understand it was the morning before the final, which they went on to win. But what was strange to us was this dip on the 10th of March, and it didn't take Grant and Sean Sermon and Andre Long to tell us that the reason for this is test week. And this is important because it's not a sports stress, it's an academic stress, but physiologically it's the same stress to the body. And the feedback we got from this after we presented it to the Varsity Sports guys is they've now engaged their rugby players and made training during test weeks more optional, just so that they can try to reduce the stress on the sports side. Obviously, it's difficult to reduce the academic stresses. These are student athletes, after all, who have to perform at a pretty high level. So then our case study 2 we started doing injury surveillance in Corsairs rugby in 2018, and from these results, which are summarized on the right-hand infographic, we found that the concussion rates were fairly high. In fact, they were 6 times higher than the most comparable cohort of rugby players, which is obviously a bit alarming, and not surprisingly, tackling was most frequently associated with concussion. And when we gave this feedback to World Rugby, it was a World Rugby funded study in 2018, their response was, we think you guys need to do something to try and reduce this concussion rate. And their suggestion was a tackle law variation to lower the tackle height, which they were busy discussing in expert panels at the time. But in order to implement and evaluate this tackle law variation, you have to have fairly comprehensive video infrastructure in place, which Corsairs rugby doesn't have. So we had to apply to World Rugby for quite a bit of money just to set up the infrastructure. So the law variation infrastructure we have in place is a research assistant and a PhD student who's also a medical doctor, Rian van Tonda. We then employ students as filmers, video coders, and we use Stellenbosch University IT infrastructure as well to assist with recording and storing all of the matches. We have injury recorders assisting the doctors with recording details of all injured players that come in, and the SA Refs Academy are also vital in obviously implementing the law. But as I'll show you on the next slide, Grant van Velden, this is an unintended benefit of our relationship with Māori Sport. When Grant van Velden heard about this idea, he had a brilliant suggestion, because they'd been doing some preliminary work with the refs, and they had a lot of success with using head-mounted GoPros. And so we were able to get the latest GoPro technology, which has stabilization technology. Now, I'm not allowed to show you the clips. Those are protected under the ethics of this study. But I've got a screenshot here of what the referee sees, and you can see the fly-off is about to catch this ball, and I can tell you from watching the clip that he's also about to have a bit of a head knock from this number 8 who comes in. And what's great for us is to be able to see how the referee and the players obviously react to that, and we're coding that and collecting all of this for research purposes, which is amazing. Just the final case study I'm going to show you is that Sean Surman actually approached us saying he had seen this study by Newport et al. On 9 national sprint athletes in the UK. And the study had tried to assess the perceptions of the athletes about training monitoring, as Grant alluded to, and in some of the questions that were asked. These are very different type of athletes. They're student athletes, they have inquiring minds. So it was very important to understand what they thought of filling in this data. And as you can see, if you look at the gray bars on this graph I'm showing you, that was the findings of the Newport study from the 9 national sprint athletes. You can see the Māori Sport athletes are actually in general a lot more positive about the training, monitoring and feedback that they're doing. There are 6 outliers, or 6% are outliers on the far left, and strongly disagree and disagree categories, but that's also useful information that Māori Sport can use to try and understand and improve on that in the future. And the second thing this enabled us to do is ask practical questions such as, how often would you like feedback? And they indicated on a weekly, or most of them indicated on a weekly basis. And then in what form would you like this feedback? And most actually indicated they'd like the feedback to come within the SmarterBase app. So we thought, well, that's a simple solution. We took it back to SmarterBase, and they actually told us they'd never had that request before. Now, bear in mind, the system is used by the Australian Institute of Sport, Liverpool Football Club, and it goes to show that this is a different cohort of athletes we're dealing with here, that they want to know what's going on. So we're actually in the process of working with SmarterBase's developers to try and develop a meaningful feedback that athletes can receive through the app to keep them engaged. Yeah, so that's it from me, other than to thank everyone who's on the slide, and again highlight the really good collaboration we have with Māori Sport, and in particular the High Performance Unit, who really make this research meaningful and worthwhile. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, James. Very informative indeed. We've got plenty of time to take some more questions from our participants. So again, you're welcome to use the Q&A feature that is available on your screens. For now, I am going to turn to our presenters with a couple of questions from myself. And James, I think I'll start with you, given that you've just presented, and you alluded to this a little bit during your presentation, but do you think that partnerships between academia and sport departments at universities are an effective way to actually gain more access to technology, for example, through something like grant funding?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. There is grant funding available, and we've been reasonably successful in getting grants. I can tell you from experience, though, it's in the field of sports medicine, it's very difficult to get grant funding, and particularly when you're in South Africa, because you're faced with far bigger health priorities such as infectious disease, non-communicable disease. So there is some success, but you kind of have to apply to about 100 options before you expect to be successful. What I'm seeing as a successful sort of side route for doing that is like the group of with Ben Jones in Leeds Beckett. He has performed research with a well-known group, Catapult. So in that way, he sort of partners with industry by researching their products, and through that he gets the ability to loan Catapult devices. So then that starts becoming a mutually beneficial relationship with industry, in that industry are able to have an independent body assess their GPS units or their systems, and the academic body is able to do research once they know the systems are valid and reliable, and that way. So that's quite a good ingenious way of going about it, and maybe that's what we need to look at in future.
Yeah, I think it's very important what you point out there in terms of the industry partnerships, which is, potentially completes that triangle. So it's not just between academic space and a university sports space. Yeah. Maybe I'm also going to ask you around some of the most significant challenges with regards to the use of technology within your particular academic space. I know Grant always alludes to the sort of gremlins in the system, and that technology sometimes tends to act up when you need it most. Do you have any challenges in that regard as far as research is concerned?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously Grant and the trainers are far more at the coalface than us. But so our major concerns, and this is very much like a removed viewpoint, is data accuracy, which I spoke of earlier. I mean, luckily because of the institutional knowledge at Marty Sport, we're fairly confident of that. But a major challenge that even that is difficult to get around is data completion. And I mean, that's an issue not just here, it's an issue when I speak to the guys who use the system with the Australian Institute of Sport. They have the same issue. And so we currently, still in the phase of trying to optimize it to make it as easy as possible for the athletes and the trainers, but still to get meaningful information. So I'd say that's probably the biggest challenge, but it's also, it's an exciting one. And luckily we have this good relationship with Marty Sport to be able to work through it.
Sure. Grant, I'm going to go back to you and I'm going to ask you whether there's any advice that you can give on applying technology within low resource environments. I mean, technology tends to cost a lot of money. It's not always easy to access. Do you have maybe any advice in that regard?
Thanks, Gustav. Yeah, it's a good question. To be honest, I think the majority of people have one of the best pieces of sports technology. Everyone has it, and it's called a smartphone. And at the moment, you can download so many different apps that are available on the different platforms, whether it's through Apple or through Android. That can assist you as a coach, by taking some video footage, and then within an app you can analyze that video footage and draw angles and lines and all of that kind of stuff. So a smartphone is, if you don't have a massive budget as a team, or you're a high school or junior school or something like that, a real good piece of sports technology that you can use, and it's very simple to do, is using your phone. We're seeing a lot, or I'm seeing a lot of things coming in from overseas where there are professional sports teams which are paying loyal supporters who go to matches week in and week out. They are paying them to record matches from their perspective within the stands using their smartphones, and then submit that video footage through to them, at the end of the match, so that they can get literally a 360-degree view of their team performing. So I'm not saying that our low resource teams would be able to do something like that, but that just shows the power that you can have with just videotaping your team or your athletes performing their sport or their sports skill, and being able to review that at a later stage. I think the use of video is such a powerful, and in the past, when we used to have not so great quality cameras on cell phones, we weren't able to do that. But the majority of people have a smartphone now with a decent enough camera that can just take video footage, and you'll be surprised how many athletes, and we see it at Stellenbosch University as well, and we deal with some student athletes which come from very, very privileged schools, that have access to some pieces of technology that other schools don't, and some of those student athletes that come out of those environments have never ever seen themselves perform their sports skill before, and when they see themselves trying to do a sidestep in rugby, or trying to bowl a slower ball in cricket, for example, and they're not able to get it, and they just watch themselves perform the skill once with their coach on a cell phone screen, or an iPad, or a computer, or a TV that's been recorded using a cell phone, they immediately are able to perform that skill a bit better. So I think a starting point for any team that has very low resources is, if you want to start exploring into sports technology and how it can improve performance, your number one step should be to start recording your matches or your sports skills using a cell phone video camera or an iPad video camera, something along those lines, and to start letting your athletes watch themselves play. It's immensely powerful.
Yeah, that's very illuminating. Actually pointing to the fact that one might think just by using something as simple as a smartphone, which are becoming obviously more and more prevalent. Grant, I think this next question is probably for you as well.
Yeah.
It's come in through the Q&A function. Is from Jamie. How do you monitor players throughout their time at the university in terms of load, max reps, and that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, all of that information gets kept by the respective performance scientists or strength and conditioning coach that's working, with the team. The nice thing about SmarterBase is that all of the information can be captured online and kept within a SmarterBase cloud, if you wanted to call it that. So that information can be kept there. We would obviously back it up onto external hard drives, and there can also be records of the data, and that kept in Excel. Excel's an extremely powerful tool that any performance scientist needs to be able to master, and all of those data sets can be collected within Excel. Some of the pieces of technology that we use as well, they have their own cloud based system. So the GymAware system, for example, that we use in the gym to measure the guys and girls velocity when they're lifting weights, that has got a cloud that as they are lifting the weights and that information is coming through, it's getting fed straight into a GymAware cloud, and it is stored there, and we can access that information later. So I think it's always it's important to collect data, because you want to be able to look back at the end of the season and say, what did my season look like? Did we do enough of this? Did we do enough of that? For example. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. Different strength and conditioning coaches will have different ways of doing it, but those are in general what is available to our strength and conditioning coaches and performance scientists at the high performance unit.
Sure. I'm going to go back to James for the next question. I've got one more question for each presenter. So if the attendees want to submit more questions, this is sort of the last round. Please do so in the Q&A function. But James, I want to ask you, do you think there are any specific growth frontiers with regards to the use of technology in sport-related research in South Africa? We obviously have our own context and variables that we have to be aware of. Any particular areas of growth that you foresee in the next few years?
Yeah, Gustav, I think if you go to any international conference, the out-and-out growth frontier is machine learning, whether you're using artificial intelligence, deep learning, neural networks, whatever. Because that just, if you have a lot of data, you can just do a lot more with your time. So it's definitely not a silver bullet that some people claim it is, but it can, for example, this GPS data that Grant collects, that's an example of where a computer can save you a hell of a lot of time and start alerting you to specific issues or a player being overtrained or whatever. So I definitely think that would be good to go into, but obviously you need the resources, which are few and far between. We're lucky at Stellenbosch in that they've just opened the School for Computational Thinking and Data Science, and my hope is that I mean, Gustav, we've had this conversation offline, but my hope is that in future we can really link with that school so that we can kind of start using that skill set in the sports science and sports medicine areas. I think that would be really cool.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think especially if one looks at the so-called sort of data revolution in some of the American sport codes, like baseball, basketball, there's a lot of developments that have happened in a very, very short space of time. And I get the sense that South Africa, with all due respect, we are behind in many of those cases. Not everywhere, but I would look at that as more as a growth opportunity than necessarily a criticism. And as you say, I mean, the School for Data Science is definitely somebody that I think we want to try and involve within the sports space. Grant, I'm going to go back to you. I also want to ask you around some of the greatest challenges from your perspective with regards to the use of technology. I mean, obviously the pace of change is so quickly and technology keeps developing. Is that a specific issue within your environment in terms of staying up to date with that?
Yeah, it definitely is good stuff. I mean, the way that technology is expanding and growing is it's so difficult to stay on top of the latest stuff. You can and within a week there's something else or a better piece of software or something out there that can do the same thing, if not better. So that is a huge challenge. A lot of these pieces of technology are overseas as well. So unfortunately, in South Africa, you're dealing with an astronomical, you're trying to buy something from Europe or Australia or the United States, which makes a expensive piece of sports technology even more expensive. Challenge is that we can't spend money and replace technology year on year. So smart in the pieces of technology that we do buy, they need to come from reputable industry leaders that have got a reputation for having fantastic build quality and good software behind the hardware, if that makes sense, because it's not something that we can purchase year on year. We at the moment are looking at a between a 3 and 5 year cycle with some of our pieces of technology. That every 3 to 5 years we need to start looking at updating or upgrading some of our pieces of technology. But I think our biggest challenge within South Africa is that is our exchange rate and the fact that a lot of these pieces of technology are coming from overseas, which makes it almost unattainable for the majority of sporting bodies within South Africa.
Yeah, so that's quite a tricky situation, and perhaps again that's maybe an opportunity for other academic fields or departments to come into the space. Maybe in the field of engineering that will ultimately hopefully solve this problem or at least alleviate it by by developing some of our own technology within the South African context. I don't see any more questions in our feed, so I think at this point I would like to give a virtual round of applause to both our presenters. Thank you to Grant and James for your very interesting insights. We really hope that the attendees also enjoyed it. I just want to, sorry, I do see there's one question. Okay, sorry, there's one more question, and we do have about 5 more minutes. I'm going to ask to both Grant and James, what is the one piece of technology that you cannot do without? So I'm going to make that the last question. James, you can go first.
I think I'll just repeat what Grant said. I mean, it's my smartphone. I mean, I don't even own an iPad because I think smartphones, they would do absolutely everything that you need. That's the only piece of technology I need.
And Grant?
Yeah, I'm sorry, it's going to sound very boring, but I would have to agree with James. I mean, the amount of things that you can do on your smartphone these days, you know, it's a little laptop and a computer in your hand. So whether it's making meeting appointments or attending a Zoom call or a Microsoft Team call, you can do absolutely everything and anything on your phone with an app and with some creativity. So it would definitely be my smartphone as well.
100%. Thanks, gentlemen. I'm going to leave it at that. As I said to the attendees, we will make this recording available afterwards, and feel free to reach out offline to take the conversation further. We look forward to having you on board for some of our further webinars. Have a great afternoon further, and we'll hopefully chat again soon. Goodbye, everyone.